me ask you guys a simple question. How many of you, raise your hands, how many of you would like to live to 100 or more? No matter what? Yeah, so take a moment and stand up for about 30 seconds if you would, and I know this is a contrivance, but you've been sitting a while. Turn to the person next to you and tell them why hands went down when I said no matter what. What do you think the conditions are that people need to live to 100 and wish to? So I've had a bit of an odd career. I initially went to school to be a physicist. It was the late 60s. I heard the siren call of California and the human potential movement. I dropped out of college and became interested in psychology of the body. I began what is now a 49-year yoga practice. I wrote my first book, Body Mind, when I was 22. A group of us came together in Berkeley in 1973 and made up the phrase holistic health. Our first project was working with the elderly, and here I am talking to you 45 years later, 40-something years later. What I'm going to try to do in the next little while is to share with you a few interesting themes. I'm going to talk about this longevity revolution we're in the middle of, and then I'm going to talk to you about the demographic shifts that are upon us, and then I'm going to take a little bit of a peek from a non-medical scientist side about what we hope you guys accomplish in the years to come. The deal I'd like to make with you, though, is that I'm going to try to tell you a slightly different version of this story than perhaps the one that's in your head right now. So I'm going to ask you if you'd be willing to take a half an hour and take all the things you currently think about medicine and exponentials and aging and longevity and just park them and allow me to tell you this story. Is that a deal? Do we have a deal? All right, we have a deal. Okay, let's start out with the longevity revolution. A little bit of historical perspective. The truth of it is that people have been searching for longevity forever. Ponce de Leon, 700-800 years ago, was not looking for, farmland. He was looking for magical fountains of youth. By the way, most of the explorers were looking for magical fountains of youth because the emperors and queens and kings were getting older and hurting, and they were trying to figure out what's the purpose of all this money and wealth and property if you're going to hurt and die. It wasn't just Ponce de Leon. If you go back several thousand years before that, Dychtwald, one of the original Taoist sort of magical immortals, had the pill of immortality. And for those of you that have been fascinated by Taoism, one of the basic premises are that you could transcend aging, transcend mortality, and become immortal. Hasn't quite worked. And by the way, the alchemists were not trying to turn straw into gold. They were trying to rid the body of its impurities. The alchemist led to the chemist led to the doctors. The doctor led to Daniel Kraft. And here we are here today on the same beat. Truth of it is that none of these things really amounted to much of anything. It wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century, with the arrival of public health departments, doctors began washing their hands. We began thinking that filth had some correlation to disease, and changes started occurring in terms of mortality and illness and longevity. Breakthroughs in the late 20s. Antibiotics rediscovered a decade later, which put diseases down that used to take people's lives early. How many of you are completely certain you know what this is a picture of? Could you raise your hands? How many of you are not quite sure? Okay, that's progress. These are iron lungs. This was the 1940s. And in these iron lungs, if you look carefully, there are people. You see their heads. So if you had poliomyelitis, you find yourself living in an iron lung for the rest of your life, and it would breathe for you, and you related to the world through a mirror. And many people thought in the 1940s, we've got to create better iron lungs. We've got to create more mobile iron lungs. We've got to create iron lungs that you can move around. And then Jonas Salk came along, and here's a picture with young Peter Diamandis, I think. Jonas Salk came along and said, no, we've got to stop this disease. We have to stop this disease. And now most of you don't even know what an iron lung is. Can we imagine in this miraculous future that some of your kids will be at a meeting like this and somebody will say, have you ever heard of cancer? Clueless. That will happen because of what you do when you leave here. 20th century filled with miraculous breakthroughs in pharmacopoeia, refrigeration so we could store and manage foods. We learned about taking care of our own bodies. And before you knew it, we were even going further, and we were beginning to decode DNA, the miraculous work of Francis Collins and Craig Venter. The effect is that if you look at the average life expectation over the past 1,000 years, something quite remarkable has happened. That throughout all of history, most people didn't age, they died. So in the 1850s, couples didn't say, gee, honey, what would you like to do after retirement? Because you'd be dead. Our medical system didn't need to be expert at things like hypercholesterolemia, adult onset diabetes, osteoarthritis, or Alzheimer's, because most people died young of acute infectious diseases, accidents, trauma, childbirth, before they lived long enough to have these chronic degenerative diseases of aging. I'm going to click this device and show you the average life expectation not over 1,000 years, but over the past 100,000 years. And here the story gets interesting, because medical anthropologists now tell us that throughout 99% of human history, the average life expectation worldwide has been under 18 at birth. So that doesn't mean that there have not been 40-year-olds and 70-year-olds. There have, but not many. And what I want to point out to you is that this has never happened before. Never. And it's not over. And so while people often think the new frontier is tech, or the new frontier is what the young people are going to do next year, the new frontier is longevity. This is the big one. 2/3 of all the people who have ever lived past 65 in the entire history of the world are alive today. And one of the questions that a lot of people are asking is, when am I old? Important to put a little thumbtack in here that the age 65, which is what most of us use as a marker, was picked by Otto von Bismarck in the 1880s in Germany, when the life expectation in the Americas and Europe was 45 years. So first of all, Bismarck was a very clever actuary. Be a little bit like giving people their old age benefits today starting in 98. And even though many of you are futuristic and future-leaning and exponential, we still have our minds stuck on what 65 was in the 19th century. Boy, if there was any group of people that ought to be progressive about how aging is transforming itself, it should be us. I was invited to provide commentary on CNN when John Glenn announced he was going to be going back up into space at 77. And I know Glenn. I had testified beside him in Washington. He's a very tough guy. So I watched his first couple of interviews, and there was a lot of young reporters saying things like, well, you'll be 77, aren't you a little old for this? And what if your head blows up? And what if your arteries explode? And Glenn turned to these reporters, and he said, hey, just because I'll be 77 doesn't mean I still don't have dreams. Wow, I'll tell you, it really made me think. Along the way, I did get a doctorate in psychology, so a little part of me is a psychologist, and thought to myself, wow, I think we think that young people have hopes and dreams. And that once you get to be 40 or 50 or 60, you've either fulfilled them or not, and then it's time to become an old person. Even yesterday, Mr. Gelb, who I thought his presentation was fabulous, opened it up by saying, who's got imagination? Who's got ideas? It's kids. Well, Da Vinci did much of his best work in his 5th and 6th decade of life. So maybe we all need to think about, what are people thinking of when they're 52? Or 71, or 126. And is that frontier yet to be sculpted? Oh, let me show you an example. So next year at this conference, I'd like to see 5 extraordinary centenarians here because that's what, I mean, if we do better at health, we're going to have a lot of centenarians. So let's see what that's all about. On top of this longevity phenomenon, which all by itself is utterly and totally transformational and opportunistic because it's never happened before, we have a demographic play as well. In the United States, and I'll widen it out to the world, 92% of all women had babies in the 18 years after World War II, averaging 4 kids each. 1 every 10 seconds, about 4 million a year. It was a massive phenomenon, but it was also a marketplace phenomenon. Because as those babies came along, the products that met their needs at each stage of life exploded with growth. People looked at the farmland circling the cities, and somebody said, well, all these young families are outgrowing their row houses in Newark, New Jersey, where I grew up, or St. Louis, or San Diego here. So let's build a whole new notion of housing. Let's call it a suburb, and with more bedrooms and a little property. And people said, you're out of your mind. That'll never work. Those regions grew in value by 500% in that decade. And it wasn't just the houses, it was all the stuff, the refrigerators, the carpeting, the telephones, that populated these young families because of this baby boom. And every step of the way, and I could show you probably 1,000 slides, every step of the way as this baby boom migrates across the lifeline because it was preceded by a baby bust and followed by a baby bust, opens up market opportunity. Ray Kroc, himself in his 6th decade of life, realized that as he was selling Mixmasters door to door, which is that's what he was doing, he was a blender salesman, he noticed that these teenagers, new word, always seemed to be in a hurry. So it occurred to him that what the world needed was fast-eating restaurants. And people thought he was nuts because you're supposed to eat dinner slowly at home with your family. Licensed the McDonald's Brothers hamburgers, the rest was history. And one of the questions that I ask all the time is, what is this phenomenon in the future? Not McDonald's for young people, but as we have 50 and 60 and 80 and 90 and 100-year-olds, what are the businesses that are going to multiply? One way to look at this is in terms of demographic growth. And I have not heard much about it since I've been here. And by the way, I don't know that I've been to a conference that was smarter and more interesting than this one. So hats off to Daniel Kraft and all of you. But I always look for what's being covered, what's being left out. This is a map of the United States in the 1950s. And what it charts is which demographic segment grew or shrank relative to its own size in that decade. And the 1950s were a moment of growth for children's products. And by the way, pediatric medicine in 1940 had 4,000 practitioners. Now there are 60,000. So pediatric medicine came out with the baby boom as well. 1960s, the teen years for the boomers. The 20s, and by the way, raise your hand if you see a trend forming here. So one of the questions we ought to ask is what's happening now? And I'm going to show you how America, and then the world, is reconfiguring due to demographic shifts currently. This is what's happening now. I have not heard this be a driver of this industry. It ought to be. Because as smart as you are about AI and as smart as you may be about medicine, you've also in this modern age got to be smart about the undulations and seismic movements of demographic changes because they are 100% predictable and most people aren't skilled at reading the tea leaves of demography. My experience has been being an advisor to companies and governments all over the world these last 40 years, is that the way most marketers pursue this, it's like you got a 76 million pound elephant and it's migrating across the lifeline. And every year the boomers get exactly 1 year older. And by the way, if you're wondering if I'm any good at prognosticating, I will tell you that back in the 1990s, I predicted when the boomers would start turning 65. And I nailed it to the day. So the way most marketers pursue this elephant, and I would also say scientists, is they wait for the elephant to pass, and then they try to shoot arrows at its butt. You want to hit the jackpot, you get out in front and dig a big hole. By the way, in the workshop that I'll be conducting after lunch, we're going to be taking a look at what the biggest opportunities are going to be in exponential technologies as a result of this big hole that's coming. But now let me show you the world. Those countries in orange have got 15 to 20% of their population over 65, but the burgundy, Italy and Japan, are already older nations. This is where we're going by 2050. So now let's layer in the health side of the equation. And I will tell you that everyone's got their own view on this, and mine may be wrong, but I offer it up to you as someone who chews on this quite a lot. And then I'm going to give you a case example of something that several of us here in the room have worked on this last half year. What's the buzz? There's a lot of buzz these last few years on, I want to live forever. You know, we've all heard Ray Kurzweil talk about live long enough to live forever. How do you be forever young? How do you live to be 100? And by the way, as I saw Leo up here, Daniel Kraft's beautiful little boy, high likelihood that Leo's going to live to 150. So high likelihood that half of all the little kids in the world right now will live to 150 or more. Why? Do I think there'll be some extraordinary breakthrough in the next 10 years so that I might benefit? Not so sure. It's up to you guys. But for the kids today, with exponentials, 10, 20, 30 years from now, without a question. But the bigger question is, what kind of 100 do you want to live to? You want to be able to walk? You want to be able to think? You want to be able to control your bowels? You want to be able to remember anything? Question gets more complex. You know, there's a classic mythological fable, which is I'm seeing my friends who I'll introduce later, Elad and Philip here, that they enjoy. The story of the beautiful goddess Eos, who falls in love with a mortal warrior named Tithonus. And she goes to Zeus's chamber and asks Zeus to grant this strapping, handsome young warrior immortality. And Zeus says, sure, that's what you want. Yes, done. And as she's leaving Zeus's chamber, she realized she forgot to ask for health. So as the fable goes, Tithonus got older and sicker, and his organs rotted, his brain became demented, his bones crumbled, but he could never die. So the question we want to ask is the idea long life, or are we trying to match our health spans to our lifespans? And that's a far more interesting exercise. There are changes with the body as we age. More likelihood of circulatory problems, arthritis of the joints, pain may be the prevailing issue of the next 20 years. Varicosity in the veins, orthopedic impairments. And I could just really spin your mind here. So this is what's coming. And we even know sort of the numbers. We know the costs. Yet we have not organized our medical system, whether it's exponential or linear, to deal with the conditions of an aging population. Whoops. And people often think of the big ones. All right, let's go after cancer. But you know what? Disequilibria is a big deal. We have a third of the elderly in the world fall each year. A third fall each year. Balance, big issue. Xerostomia, who cares about dry mouth? But if you have dry mouth, you may have more difficulty sleeping, or you might snore more, and therefore you won't be as sharp in the morning. We could go through every single one of these, and they're interesting. They're all interesting territories of opportunity. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that much of our medical infrastructure, and certainly our reimbursement, are particularly talented at dealing with acute events of illness. My son is 27. If he breaks his foot, he'll go to emergency room. Something will be done. He'll get better. It's over. But my dad had diabetes, so he was blind for 12 years. Very complicated. My mom had Alzheimer's, broke her hip, had to have valve replacement. Very complicated. Chronic conditions and multiplicity of chronic conditions is the new normal in an aging population. So how do we match health span to lifespan? A few of my thoughts. I've got 3 general categories. And I could spend, and I wish I could spend, a week on this. But I'm just going to spend a few minutes on each one, and my intent is to just sort of prime the pump of your own great thinking. First, do we have health professionals that are longevity ready or aging ready? Well, let's look at for an example. We have about 120-something medical schools in the United States. There's only 13 departments of geriatrics. What? And 95% of all the doctors and nurses who will have graduated this last year will not have taken one elective in geriatric medicine. What? Now, I'm not saying we need 50,000 geriatricians. We only have about 5,000 today, but maybe we do. And I was fascinated to look at the program, and last night I went on the program and typed in pediatrics, and there's quite a large number of pediatricians here. No geriatricians here, except I met somebody from Bayer who is a geriatric psychiatrist, so there's one. One, maybe 2. Wow. If longevity is the theme of the future and demography is tilting world populations towards the real growth and the real demand are people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and beyond, how could we not have geriatrics represented here? Or maybe it should be renamed. Maybe it should be about longevity generally. What else? The doctor-patient interface. When I was growing up, and I was born in 1950, when I was a teenager, I was fascinated to discover that the prescriptions our doctor wrote were written in Latin. How many of you are young enough where that's a new thing to you? You haven't heard of that? Yeah, they were written in Latin. It's truth. And the doctors wrote it in Latin, the pharmacist would translate it, and the idea was that you as the patient or consumer, you weren't supposed to know what it was. You were just supposed to do it. Now, the rebellion in the early 1970s that I was very much an activist in was not only a political rebellion, it was rebellion against medical authority. And we wanted to get our hands on physicians' desk references, and women wanted to control their own bodies, and the Boston Women's Health Collective was perhaps, the real edge of the spear in terms of we want to know our bodies and make our own decisions, and that led to all sorts of things. So now we have a world where we have lots of access. Do I think this is a good thing? I do not. I think this is like Pong. I also remember Pong. I remember when Pong came along in the early 1970s, it was a very simple-minded video game, but for those of us who had never seen a video game, it was amazing. Why is this Pong? Hey, how am I supposed to figure out all this stuff? How is an 84-year-old living alone who's got a bruise supposed to be able to go on the web and make sense of it? You folks are brilliant. I mean, looking through the bios showing up at this conference, I thought to myself, man, oh man, it's like a temporary Manhattan Project here. What a powerhouse. But most people in this population are not skilled at filtering or vetting or sorting their way through information, especially if they have several things going on at the same time. I'm fascinated, not as Uber as the model, although I'm an Uber client, and I think that's certainly a transformative technology. I'm more fascinated to see the way people use Waze. Here's where I am, and you're going to real-time factor all the different options and choices, get me to where I want to go. I'd like to have a health Waze. Here I am, I'm 67, I've got hypercholesterolemia, a couple of pounds overweight, I'm reasonably flexible, I have an artificial right shoulder and a few other things. Don't tell me the general information. I want to know how I get from here to there. How do I get to optimal health? And have it be altered and shifted as I change or the possibilities change. Second, the wellness marketplace. 2.0, I'm going to call it. I'm a big consumer of wellness-related products and services. Let me set this up for you. I know in your mind you may be thinking of consumers, and maybe like many advertisers or business entrepreneurs, you're thinking of people your own age or young people who are the trendsetters, the pioneers. However, let's do a little bit of a kind of reality set. People over 50. are only 44% of the adult population, but they're responsible for 52% of all personal care products and services. Now, add to that the idea that if you're 65, you are not a senior and you are not an elderly. That's been moved back to about 80. So who are we? And if I ask you to think of companies that have built their brand by celebrating youth, you know, Pepsi, for those who think young. Nike, I mean, I can give you 100. But if I think of you, tell me what brands come to mind for companies that are celebrating being 60 or 70. AARP is not a company, it's a not-for-profit. You say, did you say X-Lax? Or Viagra? Or... Yeah, so I created Centrum Silver. That was actually one of our consulting projects years ago. And the Centrum company is a full brand, and Silver did a pretty good job. But let me tell you the background to that. Up until that point, vitamins were not formulated based on age or body mass or gender. And I was fascinated by the cycle dog food business, the idea of formulating dog ingredients and nutrients based on their age. So we took that over to Centrum, and we brought in a group of scientists, and we formulated Silver, and it's done very well for them. By the way, the dogs who had their nutrient formulas adjusted based on their age grew 15-year higher life expectancy. We haven't even looked at that yet for humans. But Centrum Silver is a particular product. It's not a company brand. We haven't yet our age bias. There was fascinating material by the gentleman sitting right over there about biases yesterday, but one of the biggest biases is age bias, which most of us think, well, I'm an open-minded person. I certainly can't be biased. But tell me your name. Dale? Neil, and you were fabulous yesterday. So let's think about age bias. If I met Neil, let's say 4 years ago, and I hadn't seen him, and I were to say to him, Neil, it's great to see you. Man, you're looking really young today. He would view that as a kind of a compliment. But if I said to him, Neil, it's so great to see you. Boy, you're really looking old. We'd interpret that as an insult. I was in Nairobi a few months ago, and they refer to older people as elders, great stature. Younger people are called junior elders because they're people who want to be elder. We don't even have language about 60 and 70 and 80-year-olds, and I have not seen much humanity about whatever we call them, middlescents, elders, who knows? But it's an untapped, uncharted territory, and that's the way the world is tipping. And I will tell you that there were 76 million baby boomers in the United States getting older now. In China, there were 440 million baby boomers born after World War II and changes in the People's Republic, growing older. You're looking for opportunities. 52% of personal care products and services, 55% of all physical therapy, 57% of health club memberships, 63% of all surgeries, 63% of lab tests, 68% of all OTC drugs, 70% of all vision services, 74% of all vitamin consumption, 77% of all prescription drugs consumed, and 82% of home care users. And even yesterday when we saw the slide that some 5% of the population utilizes maybe 50% of all health care, yes, there are some conditions where young people are struggling with serious health crises, but most of the concentration of that use is elders in the last 6 months of their life. So if you're looking for the market, this is also the market. So a couple of thoughts. Notwithstanding the Centrum Silver example, when I go into vitamin stores and such, I'm amazed that they're organized alphabetically. I mean, what is that telling us? If I'm a 43-year-old woman, or I'm a 57-year-old grandfather, or I'm coming back from cancer, alphabetically is not useful. So what's a metaphor? Go to the paint store. Used to be that they had every color green in the storage room. Then someone dreamed up the idea of creating a base color that based on the color you pick, you could squirt in the right color ingredients to make any color in the rainbow. Why aren't we doing that with our nutritionals? Why are we still clunking them? I'll take 2 vitamin B3s and I'll take a vitamin C. I don't know how many, but until I get a stomach ache, and then I'll take some B12. I don't know exactly why. And by the way, I will tell you that in my mind, the single greatest scientific breakthrough in the beginning of the century was putting vitamins in gummies. So that was brilliant, because I love gummy bears. And the idea that I'm swallowing gummies by the packet, but there's no intelligence under it for me and most of us. What else? I think this is early stage. I don't think our toilets ought to look like rocket ships, but why don't we have biolabs in our homes? Why isn't it like standard? So when we get up in the morning and make our smoothie, it's not just a universal smoothie. No, I got to get off this picture. You guys are thinking the wrong thing. But we put in our nutrients based on what our unique body is telling us are exactly the nutrients we need for optimal health. And most vitamins and nutrients and foods are based on minimum requirements. Why not invert it and have it based on optimal requirements? So what should you, as a pregnant woman, what should you, as someone who's got a little bit of heart issues, what should you be taking each hour, each day to be optimally healthy? What else? I gave a speech maybe 20 years ago to the chairman of the Fortune 100. And as a lark, I said to them, I hadn't thought of this in advance. I said, let me ask you guys a question. It was about 80% men. I said, if you looked in the mirror and you saw yourself getting old, and I had the secret of forever young, and it was a pill or a bath or a drink, whatever, how much would you pay? And it would make you feel and look like you were 30 again. What percentage of your net worth would you give me for that? People were looking around thinking. I said, okay, how many of you would give 10% of your net worth? Every hand went up. 20%, 30%, 40%. The average response was 90%. And at dinner, I said, explain that to me. They say, hey, if you're 70 and you're losing it, it doesn't matter how much money you have. But with my Rolodex, if I could feel like I'm 30 again, I could make it all back in a couple of years. Which surfaces a very interesting issue, which was sort of dealt with in this fabulous panel yesterday with the wonderful physician from Brooklyn and the story of Duke and the 2 gentlemen who were talking about the philosophy of access. We heard a lot of outcry when it came to financial inequality. Whoa, what happens when longevity becomes purchasable? How are we going to feel when Elon Musk gets to buy an extra 100 years of youth? How are you going to feel if your mom is sick and you can't afford to buy her to be young? Here's an example from a television show a couple of months ago.
So, Gavin, Bryce is...
Very
Sound?
discreet. Keep going. This is great.
Is Bryce your assistant?
No, of course not. He's my transfusion associate.
Which is?
Are you really not familiar with parabiosis?
Can't say that I am.
Well, the science is actually pretty fascinating. Regular transfusions of the blood of a younger, physically fit donor can significantly retard the aging process.
Yeah, so buying blood. I'm not going to ask how many of you are doing that now, but I'm sure that some of you are. It's a little odd. Just the beginning of what's coming. So how do we feel about Ray Kurzweil living to be 200 and Peter Diamandis? I can see them. Here we are at Singularity. We're glad to celebrate our 150th anniversary together. I don't know. I think it's kind of cool. But that's because I am a boomer. I saw this Philadelphia magazine a few months back, and here was the cover story. Dear baby boomers, just die already. How about fitness and rehab? Boy, do I think that somebody could take what you know and forget the hospital just for a minute. Take it into the fitness centers, you know? For example, you take motion detection, which you guys are very tuned into. It's pretty sophisticated. Yet I'm telling you, when I had my shoulder replaced a decade ago and I went for physical therapy, it was bean bags and ice cubes. How many of you got some back pain? People say, what should you do about it? Exercise. What exercise? Which one? My body is asymmetrical. All the equipment in my gym are geared to symmetrical bodies. And the ergonomics of the equipment are built for 22-year-old men. Imagine a smart suit that I could wear that would tell some cloud-based information everything about how I move, how I function, and show me what to do to train me up to Olympic level. Somebody's going to create that. They're going to make us a lot healthier and more fit. We went to China. Our son's been living in China. And in the parks, all the elderly people, you know what they do? No, they don't do Tai Chi. That's in the movies. They do ballroom dancing. Truly, thousands. Because they've learned that if you can increase your ability to balance, you won't fall. So instead of the technologies to catch you when you land, why don't we have technologies to teach people how to be so well balanced they never fall? And I think we need to make everything more age-friendly. My mom and dad, they were given a software for mental training, but my dad was blind, so he couldn't load it in the computer, and my mother had Alzheimer's. She couldn't remember the instructions. And I will tell you, and I say this with respect, one always looks at fields as they emerge and as they grow and thinks, wow, what do they got? You guys have massive intelligence, and you're amazingly able to manage enormous amounts of information in short. I've never seen more covered in a presentation than Daniel Kraft did yesterday, and it was dazzling. But let's not forget the humanity side. Here's a clip, several minutes long. It's about a piece of simple technology, but it's about something more than the technology. And I offer this to you as an example. Sound?
Good morning, sir. Ready to get up? Let me get your feet up. How you doing today? Okay. Good morning. I remember always looking at my dad's arms like when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old. He had arms like Popeye. He was a tugboat captain. And I so admired his physique. And now it's a different story, you know? And that's just the way it is. So my dad had a stroke, and now he can't get around, he can't walk. And he needs me to help him out. And my son Luke and I have been doing it. And I'd do anything for him. I can give you a really good mohawk. You look like a punk rocker. There's a definite role reversal that happens. I have to wake him up in the morning and take care of him and groom him and shave him and shower him. It's actually an honor to do that for your father because he did it for me when I was a kid. My dad's got the greatest face. His squishy face is just amazing. He's sort of thin-skinned and I don't want to cut it at all. So I got to be careful with that face. Like he'll just say, do this, do that. You got to make sure that you shave my neck down. You got to do my lips up. You know, he was really particular about his sideburns. That's where your sideburns start? Yeah. I'm not going to touch your sideburns.
Okay, good.
Okay? How am I doing so far, Dad?
Okay.
You know, it takes me like a half an hour to shave my father because I have to be so careful.
Can't live without it either.
Okay, I will. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Love that face. Hi. I'm one of the lucky ones. A lot of my friends my age do not have their dads, and I still have my dad. He always says to me, he looks up at me after I pour love on him for the whole day, and he says, "I don't know what I did to deserve you." And I say, "Dad, I got you. I got you, Dad."
So that's a razor blade. All the things you guys are playing with, if they're not geared to humanity, to help. It's one thing to say 1 billion people and change the world, but where's the touch? Where's the people? Last point I'm going to make before I wind this up. Boy, am I a big believer that many of these conditions are going to need to be built in the lab, and they're going to need to be built in a crowdsource, creative way. So, for example, one of the things, as a case example, we have focused on in my little world is what scares you the most about longevity, and guess what? It's losing your mind, and for good reason. Alzheimer's disease is now the scariest disease in the world because the prevalence just ramps up with age. And people say, oh, yeah, 1 in 3, but you know what? Not me. I've got a lot of money. I know a lot of cool people. I know Craig Venter. I can buy my way around it. No, you can't. I knew President Reagan, I didn't know Margaret Thatcher, but they both had sparkling lifestyles and great medical care. They both got taken down by this disease, and you will too. And if it's not you, it's going to be somebody you really love, unless you guys do something about it. Group of us came together and created an XPRIZE team. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute, but our bold innovator is right here. This is Dr. Philip Edgecombe. Philip is a Canadian biomedical engineer, and he's about to finish his medical degree. This is Elad Azulai. Elad is an Israeli business student at UCLA, prize developer, and we put together an XPRIZE team to see if we could come up with a crowdsource approach to beating Alzheimer's. Our goals were to activate the crowd, to unleash innovation, to find the biotargets that are pre-symptomatic, that people could hit and stop this disease before we even experience it, to stop Alzheimer's, and to match brain span to lifespan. I'm going to tell you that a couple of weeks before Visioneering Summit, which was just last month, we sent notes out to some people because we thought, we think of crowdsourcing as what you do for the science side. What if we could crowdsource our advocacy? Does anybody believe in what we're doing? Can we get somebody, 3 people maybe, send in a little video clip? Don't send in your TED Talk, we said, but if you would record something just for us so we could feel like we're on the right track. Here's what came together.
Not since the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague have we been afflicted as a society across the world by such an epidemic.
As our population ages and people live longer, one of the greatest challenges we face as a nation is putting an end to Alzheimer's disease.
More than 4 million people live with dementia in Africa.
Now, Alzheimer's disease has become a global issue.
I personally experienced the devastating impacts of Alzheimer's as it has hit my family hard. My grandfather, 2 aunts, and just recently, my mother passed from the disease.
My grandmother died of Alzheimer's. My mother now has Alzheimer's. Memory gone.
Well, now the disease has come for me. I've been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's.
For almost 40 years, I've been working to find a cure and effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease.
Lily's been in Alzheimer's disease research now for over 30 years, but we know we cannot do it alone. This disease is a beast.
We've got to take a radically different approach to stopping this disease.
I don't envision there being something to save my husband or my mother, who's too old, or for me, as a matter of fact.
And one of the things we all know as scientists is that some of the greatest breakthroughs happen at the convergence of different disciplines when different perspectives come together.
So crowdsourcing, creating networks, looking for new kinds of solutions that are unique, novel, and fresh, that's the way we will make progress.
The time is now, and the XPRIZE can make it happen.
I can't think of a more important topic for an XPRIZE.
So the time really is now to go ahead and do an XPRIZE for Alzheimer's disease. The technological revolution that is applicable to this space is great.
Maybe it'll come from artificial intelligence, perhaps physics. That's the beauty of crowdsourcing a solution to this devastating health problem, and why I'm so excited about XPRIZE Alzheimer's.
We need an XPRIZE because I believe that's the only way we're going to solve this disease.
I will do all I can to support this very important initiative from the XPRIZE.
We're committed to working with the XPRIZE.
We love the concept of the XPRIZE.
But I think the XPRIZE has tremendous potential.
XPRIZE, we got to do it now, and let's get on with it.
Please cast your vote for the Alzheimer's XPRIZE. The world needs it.
Please, vote for the Alzheimer's XPRIZE team. A vote for the Alzheimer's XPRIZE team could change the course of millions of lives, including my own. Thank you.
We crushed the Visionaires Conference. Philip and Elad and their partner Sam and our team of about 100 scientists that came together. And so what I want to say to you is very simple. We are in the midst of an evolutionary moment. For hundreds of thousands of years, we've been trying to create longer-lived men and women. And we're doing it now, not all that well, but we're doing it. And in the decades to come, due to exponential technologies and ideas, we're going to see the explosion of longevity and a global tipping of demography from young to old. The question is whether or not we grow old with productivity, dignity, vitality, and health, or with disabilities, suffering, pain, and the horrors of dementia and related conditions. And I would have to say, at the risk of putting a challenge on you guys, this is up to you. Thank you for letting me be with you this morning. I'll see you guys in the breakout session. Thank you.